I am not silent because I don't care. I am silent because it hurts. This was the first thing Valentine wrote to himself on a crumpled piece of paper, sitting in the kitchen at 3:17 a.m. The tea had long since cooled. The window was half open, and through it the sound of the train could be heard, distant, like a memory you don't want to remember. He didn't know what to say. Not to Yulia. Not to himself. Not to the world. And it scared him. Because before, words had saved. And now, they were silent with him. It was a period when everything seemed blurry. The work was mechanical. The video was emotionless. The comments were like echoes that didn't touch. Yulia was sleeping next to him, but even her breathing wouldn't let him rest. Because he couldn't tell her how he felt. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't know how to explain the silence. He opened his laptop. He created a document called "A Letter to Myself When I Don't Know What to Say." And he just sat there. For half an hour. An hour. Then he wrote, "Your silence is not a fault. It's a way of being honest." This was the first sentence that didn't lie. Because he wasn't hiding. He just didn't have the words. And that's normal. Valentine remembered how, as a child, he had been forced to say, "Thank you," even when he didn't feel grateful. How he had been punished for his silence, as if it were a crime. And now, as an adult, he was still afraid that silence would make him guilty. But something had changed. He began to write not to explain, but to be. Just to be. Without excuses. I don't know what to say. But I'm here. And that's something. This letter had no structure. It was like breathing, uneven, but alive. Valentine wrote about how sometimes love is silence next to you. Like fear is not weakness, but proof that you care. Like silence is not emptiness, but a space where truth is born. He didn't show this letter to anyone. But he left it on the table. And when Yulia woke up, she saw it. She read it. And she didn't say anything. She just hugged him. And it was the loudest "I hear you" he had ever heard. You don't have to be understood to be real. Valentine wrote this phrase to himself on his phone screen while he was sitting in the subway. People around him were talking, laughing, listening to music. And he was silent. Not because he didn't have thoughts, but because he didn't have words that could convey them without distortion. Lately, he had noticed how often people expected explanations. Why are you silent? What do you feel? Say something. And each such question sounded like a demand. As if silence was a guilt that needed to be justified. But Valentine began to notice something else. Yulia didn't ask. She was just there. Sometimes she brought tea. Sometimes she put her hand on his shoulder. Sometimes she just sat next to him, looking out the window. And that was more than any "I understand you." He started keeping a diary of silence. He didn't write down words. He wrote down moments when silence was more honest than any sentence. When he didn't reply to a message because he didn't know how to say, "I'm hurt." When he didn't make a video because he didn't want to be fake. When he just lay next to Yulia, and it was a prayer without words. He wrote, "Your silence is not a guilt. It's a way to be honest. But you're allowed to be afraid." It became his mantra. He repeated it when he felt the world was pressing. When algorithms demanded content. When friends were waiting for an answer. When even he wanted to escape from himself. One day he recorded a video. Not for publication. Just for himself. There was only him, the camera, and the phrase, "I don't know what to say. But I didn't disappear." He watched this video several times. And each time he cried. Not from pain. From relief. Because he allowed himself to be. Without explanations. Without excuses. And then he wrote a new letter. Not to himself. But to someone who would one day watch his video and not know what to say. Your silence is not the end. It's the beginning. And I hear you. Even if you're silent. I'm not silent to push you away. I'm silent because I'm afraid of losing myself in the explanations. He wrote this in his notes after a conversation with Yulia, which ended in silence. Not the one that heals, but the one that cuts. She asked, Are you with me or somewhere far away? And he didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to say, I'm with you, but I'm afraid to be myself around you. Valentine began to notice how the silence that had once been his protection had become a wall. At work, he couldn't explain why he didn't want to shoot a new video. In communication, he couldn't tell his friends that he was having a hard time. In relationships, he couldn't tell Yulia that he was afraid to be weak. He wrote, "Your silence is not your fault. But if it becomes a wall, allow yourself to knock." And he began. In small steps, he wrote Yulia a message, I don't know how to talk, but I want to be around. He sent his friend an audio recording where he was just breathing. And she replied, I hear you. He recorded a video where he said, this is not poetry. This is me learning to be. These actions were not loud, but they were real. And each one is like a crack in the wall through which light passes. One evening he was sitting in the kitchen when Yulia said, I don't need words. I need you. And he answered, I am here, even if I am silent. He began to write a new letter. This time, not to himself, but to someone who is afraid that silence will destroy the connection. Your silence is not the end. But if it hurts, allow yourself to be heard. Even if it's just breathing. I didn't say anything, but I stayed. And that was more than any, I love you. It was the evening when Yulia returned home from a difficult meeting. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. She just sat on the floor, her back to the wall, and was silent. Valentine didn't ask. He didn't hug. He didn't speak. He just sat next to her, and put his hand on her hand. This gesture was language. Not romantic. Not therapeutic. But human. And she responded, not with words, but by not moving away. Their silence became a dialogue. Valentine began to notice how much could be said without words. When he left tea on the table, knowing that Yulia didn't want to talk. When she put his sweater on the chair, because she knew he was freezing, but wouldn't say it. When they just looked at each other, and it was, I'm here, without a single sound. He wrote in his diary, Your silence is not silence. It is a language that not everyone can listen to. And he began to learn. Not as a poet. As a listener. To listen when Yulia is silent, but her shoulders are tense. To listen when friends do not write because they do not know how to ask for help. To listen to yourself when your heart is clenching, but your mind says, everything is fine. He created a new series of videos, without text. Just frames. A hand touching a window. Light falling on an empty chair. A look that does not seek an answer. And people wrote, I do not know why I am crying. But this is about me. This video said what I could not formulate. Your silence is my truth. Valentine understood. I don't have to speak in order to be. I have to be in order to speak. And he wrote a new letter. This time, to himself, when he would not know what to say again. Put your hand on your heart. Look out the window. Sit next to you. This is also speech. And it is real. I didn't betray you. I just didn't know how to be there without losing myself. He wrote this in a letter that he never sent. The letter was to Yulia. To himself. To everyone he had never answered. Because sometimes silence is not indifference. It is the fear that words will break something important. Valentine sat in the park, looking at people who were talking, laughing, arguing. And he felt alone. Not because he didn't want to be with them, but because he didn't know how to be with himself next to them. Lately he started to have doubts. Is he losing touch with Yulia? Does his silence seem cold? Is his silence turning into an escape? He wrote, Your silence is not a betrayal. But if it hurts, let yourself come back. And he started to come back. Not loudly. Not dramatically. He told Yulia, I'm afraid to be weak. But I'm here. He recorded a video where he just sat and looked into the camera. No text. No music. Just presence. He wrote a comment under his video, Asterisk, this is not an answer. This is me learning to be. Asterisk. People started writing. I thought silence was the end. Now I see it's a pause. You taught me not to punish myself for not knowing how to speak. Your silence is my freedom. Valentine understood. I don't have to be loud to be present. I have to be honest, even if it sounds like silence. And he wrote a new letter. This time, to himself, when he again feels that silence seems like an escape. You didn't run away. You stayed. Just not in words, but in silence. And that is also love. Okay, Valak, here's the final part, not about completion, but about acceptance. Valentine is no longer afraid to be silent, because he knows silence is also a way of being, and being is already enough. Series, Things I Learned. Topic 5, A Letter to Myself When You Don't Know What to Say. Part 6, Being is Already Enough. I don't have to speak to be. I have to be to speak, when I'm ready. It was an ordinary morning. Valentine woke up not from anxiety, but from the light that fell on his face. Yulia was still asleep. Her breathing was even, like the rhythm that keeps life in the body. He had no plans for the day. No words. But he had himself. And this was new. He made tea, sat by the window, and opened the same document, A Letter to Myself When I Don't Know What to Say. He read everything he had written before, and didn't add anything, because for the first time, there was no need to explain. He just was. It wasn't healing. There was no catharsis. It was acceptance. Acceptance that silence is not guilt. That fear is not weakness. That silence is not the end. That being is enough. He remembered how he had once been afraid that he wouldn't be heard, that his silence would be perceived as indifference, that he would lose touch. But now he knew, connection is not just words. It is presence. It is a hand on the shoulder. It is tea on the table. It is a look that does not require an answer. He recorded a video, the last in the series. There was no text, just frames. Valentine by the window. Yulia, sleeping, steaming tea, light falling on an empty chair. And at the end, the phrase, Your silence is not a fault. It is a way to be honest. And you are allowed to be afraid. This video did not go viral. But people wrote, I did not know that I needed this silence. This is not just a video. It is permission to be. I am silent. But now, not alone. Valentine smiled. Not because everything became easier, but because he was no longer hiding. And he wrote his last letter. This time, to himself, when he was ready to speak again. When you find words again, don't forget that you were real even without them. Your silence is also you. And you are enough.